right, welcome back. It's time for another Young Heretics conversation. This is our occasional interview series. We don't have like a weekly interview or a regular interview, and that means I get to be really exclusive. I don't just have to have on somebody because I need a guest. So I'm only really talking to people that I'm genuinely interested in their work. I'm excited and hopeful about what they're up to. And my guest today is, I think, doing some, I hesitate to call it edgy. It can set people's teeth on edge a little bit, but I think really important work for a lot of reasons that we're going to get into in this conversation. He's written a book. His name's Jeremy Carl. He's written a book that was initially called "It's Okay to Be White," and now it's called "The Unprotected Class," and it's about this problem that we're having in America specifically, but in the West more generally, which is about how to respond to anti-white racism. And I think, and I imagine a lot of our listeners here agree with me, that there is such a thing as anti-white racism. I mean, Jeremy's case, and he makes it very sort of meticulously and in a scholarly way, is that that kind of racism exists and is indeed in some ways state sanctioned. And the problem here for folks like us is that you want to respond with kind of the appropriate condemnation of this trend. But unlike, say, a pro-Black racial activist or a pro-Asian racial activist or a pro-Hispanic kind of activist, I and others are really hoping to get past all of this like race obsession, because we don't think that race is the most important thing. And so Jeremy is trying to, I think, really carve out an argument, tread a line here where he's saying, yeah, there is such a, like, race matters in the sense that there is racism, and whiteness matters in the sense that there is anti-white racism that has become fashionable. And so how do we respond to that in a way that doesn't end us up just at daggers drawn, kind of, you say your race is best, I say my race is best, because where does that get us? So I'm very grateful that there's always new people coming onto the podcast, and I'm glad you're here, whether you've been listening from day one or whether you're new. But it occurs to me that if you're new, you might not know that I do another podcast, and you should go check it out. It's part of the Claremont Institute, which is where I work. And we do a lot of, I think, really important stuff about America, specifically the recovering and defending the American idea, carrying it forward into the modern day. And one of the things we do over there is we have a website called The American Mind, and The American Mind has a podcast called The Roundtable, which is what it sounds like. It's a group of guys that edit the site in some way or another, and we just talk about the news of the week. It's every Thursday, I guess, we put it out. And if you like this show, you should go check it out. So I'm going to drop a link to that in the show notes. And Jeremy came on the show this week to talk about his new book and to talk about this difficult problem in American life. I really found that conversation fascinating, and I'm going to take it forward here with him, specifically with the focus on what we care most about, and that is the West, which is often associated with whiteness and is subjected to a lot of the same slanders and attacks, I think very unfairly, but nevertheless in a way that merits real discussion. So let's do it. Let's bring Jeremy Carl on to discuss his new book, formerly titled "It's Okay to Be White," now titled "The Unprotected Class." All right. I am here with Jeremy Carl, the man himself, walking, breathing YouTube warning label, and author of the new book, The Unprotected Class, previously titled, was it "It's Okay to Be White," Jeremy? Is that what the original one was? Okay. Well, maybe we can use...
That was the original title.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's lead in with that then. I am curious, is that still the thesis of this book, that it's okay to be white?
Yeah. Yeah. And, it's great. I mean, we talked about this a little bit just before the taping here, and that it actually, arguably, better than any argument that I could make in my book, the saga I had with this title really proved my point. And I do actually refer to this, and not my own saga with it, but this phrase. I talk a little bit about it in one of the last chapters of the book. But essentially, this was a phrase, and it had its origins in 4chan, which is this online kind of very anarchic right-wing message board.
Real ones know. Oh, yeah.
7 years ago or something. it they began appearing these posters with very plain lettering, and it just said it's okay to be white. These appeared around college campuses and things like
Hmm.
that. And inevitably, what happened was a total storm of various things that you can imagine, and people denouncing it and saying all these things. And um, this was kind of the point of the people who did it, the sort of anarchical people, is this shouldn't be an exceptional statement. It's okay to be Hispanic. It's okay to be Asian American. It's okay to be Black. It should also be okay to be white. But yet, in our cultural context, to put out that type of a statement was kind of seen as very radical, very aggressive, that you were attacking somebody else in some way. And so I think in many ways, it really sort of struck to the heart of the fact that our culture is very uncomfortable with whiteness in all of its manifestations, that it doesn't really like whiteness in, at least in certain ways. Obviously, in other ways, whiteness is still normative in certain ways in American culture. But anyway, I got the editorial staff to sign off on this provocative book title, and then we got to the very end, and we'd been working with that running title for quite a while. And finally, the sales team came in and said, "Hey, we cannot sell that at Costco and Walmart." But again, and you think about it, and there shouldn't be anything shocking or objectionable about that statement, and yet in our cultural context there really is. And again, I think it really made my argument more than anything I was probably clever enough to do in the book.
That is amazing. I really want now to picture just going into Costco. I mean, I'm like a very regular Costco shopper, and especially the
Yes.
Nashville Costco crowd. I'm contemplating what it would be like for them to encounter a book titled "It's Okay to Be White." But yes, this is a telling anecdote because in the book, in fact, you are making quite sort of straight laced and non polemical argument, now expressed by this new title, The Unprotected Class, that this is essentially the one racial category, if that's what it is, that it's okay to discriminate against in America, or even encouraged in some ways
Right.
to attack. And typically, I think people who respond to this have to fight a kind of two front war, or they have to balance between two possible responses, I guess, to anti whiteness. One is actually race doesn't matter at all. And then you're in a kind of
Right.
lopsided dispute between people who think race is
Right.
everything and yours is the bad one, and people
Right.
that want to just take the whole issue off the table, which is a somewhat weaker position.
Right.
Versus then saying actually whiteness is, I mean, okay is one version, but good, right, fine, whatever, that then
Right.
sort of reifies the category, accepts whiteness as like an identity, claims it or whatever.
Right.
And I wonder what you think about all that. What is the proper response here to the anti-white position?
Well, it's a fascinating question, and there are sort of different ways to go about it. And Chris Rufo, who is one of the book's endorsers, has been, on a practical sense, the most effective guy, I
Mm.
think, in kind of talking about some of these issues. And yet, even though I think I have 95+% agreement with what Chris does, and probably the 5% I don't, I'm wrong because he's been so effective. Um, I mean, I do think I have a slightly different shade on some of it, because I think Chris really, he's the guy who put critical race theory on the map and then kind of killed it in Virginia, and it led to the Republican governor's there's election. He's done a lot of other things, and he really kind of pushes this colorblind equality. And that's a thing that I think, of course, sounds really great.
Mm.
And I think is something that in many ways is a reasonable thing to aim at. I think the wrinkle I have is that I'm enough of a student of power,
Mm.
that I think the kind of way this dynamic has worked in our society is the left has really used race very polemically and very aggressively over a number of years. And the right's response is always this kind of constitutional, very airy fairy, aiming at colorblind equality, and we get run over.
Mm.
And so I think in the service of getting something toward that, again, I'm not naive enough to think that these categories totally go away, although I do think that they are malleable to some degree. But I think in terms of doing
Mm-hmm.
that, um, what I would want to see is just something that says, look, more of a mutually assured destruction, Cold War type mentality, where if you are going to use race, we are going to make that incredibly painful for you, and that probably involves organizing white people as white people in the same way that MLK organized black people and allied whites and others. But he wasn't like denying there was such a thing as black people or that that mattered. So
Mm-hmm.
that's just a slight wrinkle. Although I think certainly, as I point out in the early book, kind of a focus on these sort of constitutional rights and natural rights is a infinitely better moral and practical gauge than a politics of whiteness per se.
Mm-hmm. Well, right, and MLK is an interesting figure to invoke, at least in kind of his most famous public-facing statements, leaving aside
Right.
like the later kind of slide into weird Marxism or
Sure.
whatever. Just thinking of color blindness, that for MLK, like color blindness is compatible with a certain form of defense of black people that says, look, maybe
Right.
this is kind of an invented American category, but it's now here and we're
Right.
suffering material harm and disadvantage because of discrimination that's based on it. And so, you
Right.
know, playing that game while also insisting that in the last analysis before the law, this isn't the most fundamental thing about us. This isn't what should
Right.
determine our. That all makes sense to me. Um, I wanted to pick up on something that we were kind of talking about related to all this on the roundtable also this week, and that this is a Western culture podcast. It's a podcast that it has its
Right.
origins in some sense in a reaction against the kind of hatred of the Western canon and the way in which the West and the
Sure.
Western canon has in some ways become in the literary world the analog of whiteness. Like there's a lot of parallels there with what
Right.
people say that the West becomes a bad word and the same that white becomes a bad word,
Right.
and starts to stand in for all this disgusting stuff. Now, when you talk about the Western canon, I think it's very easy to make a pro Western canon case. Like it's not just this
Right.
is
Right.
okay, this is actually a treasure. And that does leave you open to this sort of interesting objection, which is okay, you say that everybody is equal, you say that race doesn't matter, and you point to like one or two sort of African bishops to make the case that Christianity is not white or Jesus wasn't white. But actually, and I'm picturing now my like most intelligent detractor here, like
Right.
99.9% of this stuff that you're talking about comes from like Anglo-Saxon, Nordic, Germanic peoples. And aren't you really
Right.
making a case for white supremacy via another means? Um,
Right.
and so I guess I wonder, like, is there a way to actually appreciate, you know, cultures that are now designated as white that I would just more call sort of European, without
Right.
falling for the identity politics trap, and to sort of say, okay, yeah, this stuff is great and it did come from these places. Maybe that's not the
Yeah.
most important thing about it. I don't know. Like, how would you go about that, I guess?
Well, it's fascinating, and we're both, to kind of out ourselves here. We're both Yale
Mm.
guys. I'm of a somewhat elder vintage than you. Did you take 129 or 125 for
Oh my
English?
gosh. I can't
I
remember.
don't know. Maybe it was different. Like I took 129, which was kind of like the really intense survey for non majors.
Mm.
I think 125 was. I picture you as a 125 type guy. Maybe you weren't. That was like for the people who were really going to major in it. And I think back on it because again, this was 30 years ago for
Mm.
me. Actually, more than that, 33 years ago that I walked in as a freshman. I took that course, and it was essentially this absurdly long survey of Western literature. And it was really white literature, but it didn't say that it was white literature, but that's functionally what it was. I don't know that we read, at least in that course. I mean, maybe we read a non white author at some point,
Mm.
but I can't remember. I mean, I think we ended with Buchner and like stuff like that. Um, and so I can't imagine that happening at Yale today. I mean, maybe it does, but I think our elite culture, quote unquote, has changed so much that like you almost couldn't get away with that. But I think even more broadly beyond that, because I don't think and there's a rich tradition of people like V.S. Naipaul, one of my favorite authors, who really, as an Indo-Trinidadian, the depth with which he kind of embraced the English tradition, right, was a
Mm-hmm.
really core element of his identity. So to me, that's kind of how I like to view it, as it's very particularistic at a certain way, but it's ultimately something that is also permeable
Mm.
to everyone at a certain point without kind of denying that it has a certain historical identity. But it's interesting how much this is a live issue. I saw some leftist on X this week. There's a site that I follow. I think it's called Culture Critic or
Mm-hmm.
something, and they do all this great architecture that they put out. And there's nothing political in their content at
Yep.
all, and they've got like 2 million followers or something. Um, and this guy does this like 30 post thread trying to show how this is all hidden white supremacy, and it was just not unhinged enough to kind of like be worth engaging with
Mm-hmm.
a little bit, even though I totally disagreed with the premises. But I think it just sort of goes to your point that this is a very live issue, even in ways that we might not see as racially coded in an overt way.
Right. I saw that thread and I too was sort of interested in it. A bunch of people tweeted at me to talk about it on the show. So I guess here we are talking about it. And I would like to. I mean,
Yeah.
um, so I also follow Culture Critic, I think, or I follow enough people who follow Culture Critic that I'm
Who follow
constantly,
cultural
yeah,
critic and you
exactly,
see it.
always
Yeah.
seeing those posts. And, you know, one point that I'm always making on the show is, okay, you're coming at me because you think that Western culture is insufficiently inclusive of other perspectives. But where the hell do you think you got the idea of including other
Of
perspectives? Like from
course.
Homer, right? From the fact that
Of
Hector is
course.
the most noble character in the Iliad, and so there's that element
Right.
of it that yes, you can point to and I think even value like the distinct origins, be they ethnic or I think kind of maybe ethno-national or whatever of these ideas, while also celebrating that one of the most important ones that kind of emerges is this cosmopolitan or brotherhood of man thing. I mean, that comes from Genesis 1
Yeah.
as well, which is not a quote unquote white text, as it were. Um,
Right.
but then, right, you have this guy who comes on and he does basically like the Theodore Adorno fascist scale with this Twitter account of pictures and things.
Right.
And on the one hand, psychotic. On the other hand,
Right.
like that account is a little right wing coded, and it's right wing
Yes,
coded
it
in this
is.
way.
And that's why I follow it
Of course, right.
probably without even
It's why all
realizing it.
my friends follow it, right? And it's right wing coded in this way that like just sort of enjoying nice things has gradually become conservative coded as the left has set
Yeah.
itself against. You know,
Beauty and,
yeah, beauty, like honor, even a certain
right.
kind of nostalgia, although there's something
Right.
kind of forward looking about it too. um so I wonder, like, is there a politic? You talked about wanting, rightly I think, to avoid a politics of whiteness, but is there a reverse to this, that like are you speaking in this book to a certain political movement? Do you hope that like the MAGA and Trump world will listen to you, or are you speaking to
Yeah.
Americans as Americans? I guess.
So I'm doing a little bit of
Mm.
both, but actually the group I'm probably speaking to least in some ways, kind of ironically, is the people who are already convinced about my argument, of which there are many,
Mm.
in my world.
Yeah.
I know a lot of them. I really tried to say, I kind of said, to kind of use internet lore, I've said, um, the most edge lord I could give this book, and they will learn some
Hmm.
things about the way race is working in America. And again, I go through 11 different areas, from kind of how we talk about crime to healthcare and the military and the church even, and I sort of document where anti-white discrimination or racism is going on in all of them. Even that the most online kind of radicalized person will learn some things they don't know.
Mm-hmm.
But at the core, I also wanted to write a book that person could go give to their mom or dad, Their mom or dad may not even be convinced of this at all. They may not even really kind of consciously allow themselves, because of the type of discourse we have in
Mm.
America, to acknowledge this as an issue. And for them to maybe get past the title, which is still a little
Mm.
provocative, and read it and feel like it's very fair. I mean, if anything, it's not a polemical book. It's a just the facts man book. I think it speaks for itself. The data. I got somebody, a journalist, a couple weeks ago, who emailed me and said, hey, well, how would you support this contention that it's, anti-white discrimination? I said, look, I've got 973 footnotes in this book. You can check any one of
Right.
them. I think it's pretty well documented what I'm doing here. So that's kind of where I've tried to take things, at least with the book, in terms of reaching an audience. And yeah, it'll probably end up being more MAGA
Mm.
coded, but I want it to be somebody of any race who is open-minded, who's concerned about this issue, who's concerned about what actual racial harmony might look like in the US, to realize that we're going to either have to acknowledge this elephant in the room and deal with it, or the alternatives are going to be most likely some sort of a civil conflict. And again, that's not tomorrow, but the record of multi-ethnic
Mm.
democracies, where people are sort of grabbing resources from other groups, is not necessarily a good one that we want to be
Yeah.
in.
I mean, that dimension of it, I think, speaks to something that I have puzzled. I mean, the book is serving, I think, a purpose that I have felt a need for a while, although I wouldn't have maybe articulated it this way until you told me about the book. That, yeah, you really, my heart is sort of with the Costco mom. My heart is with the people that want to
Yeah,
live in the country as founded, and I think that is a multi-ethnic republic. Like, I think that is where we're equal
right.
from the law. But and there's this enormous, just like, steamroller or this constant drumbeat of racial hatred that's directed at white people, and that requires a response that is sort of from and about white people, but that is not
Right,
like white people are the best race, or white people, like this is
right.
and so I actually think that it's important to have a book like yours that sort of acknowledges this, that can pass muster with the edge lords while maybe also talking them down a little bit.
Well, it's great that you said that, because even though I did not write the book to de-radicalize
Right.
people, I think functionally that's my hope, is that they say, okay, here's this guy. He acknowledges these are real problems. He sees the same things we're
Yeah.
seeing, but he's got some forward-looking plans that are not like burn the whole country down, right?
Yeah.
And so that will be a de-radicalize. It'll rally certain troops, in the way that I would like to. This is not a whining to the refs book either.
Hmm.
This is not like, oh my gosh, I'm so sad to be white. It's awful. I'm not competing in the oppression Olympics
Hmm.
here. I'm just trying to acknowledge an actual empirical reality and say, hey, we should, as white people, speaking at least for myself, we should respect ourselves enough to stand up for
Hmm.
ourselves. And at the same time, I'm trying to suggest that we can do that within the context of the American system, within our constitutional order, within the sorts of things that have always made America great, if I can use that provocative phrase these
Right.
days, and that we don't need to kind of, LARP as Teutonic warriors or whatever else to kind of get from A to B here.
Fun as it is to LARP as a Teutonic warrior, I mean, no like shade on that,
Right.
but right, exactly. You don't. That's
Yeah.
not really a serious plan in the non-online
Right.
world. So I do want to talk with you actually about, like, some the plans as outlined in the book, or just generally. You sort of alluded to what true racial harmony looks like in 21st century
Right.
America. And I have heard a few different models floated, not actually by like radical online anons so much as by serious social scientists that acknowledge things such as the real challenge to social trust that's posed by living in a multi-ethnic, even a enlightened
Sure.
multi-ethnic society. And so, some people, for example, talk about replacing the melting pot, the vision of the melting pot, with a vision of a public park, right? Where there are these different groups of people that kind of all get along. They're maybe not. I find that like sort of necessary but not sufficient. Like I would like for us to like
Mhm.
each other more than that picture suggests.
Yeah.
And I'm curious sort of what your image is. You know, we also talked on the roundtable about Eric Kaufman's idea of white shift, which is that these sort of
Yeah.
whiteness principles that are really just kind of good ideas, like the
Right.
punctuality and patriotism and all this stuff, are actually
Right.
very amenable to, for example, most
Right.
South American arrivals. So I guess like I'm throwing these various options on the table and asking like what your picture is of a racially harmonious America.
Sure. So you mentioned Kaufman, and he was certainly a touchstone for this book. He's a multi ethnic scholar himself, although kind of phenotypically coded as white, kind of white presenting in a lot of
Yeah,
ways. I mean, I think I'm not saying anything that he has not said
yeah.
himself, um, but he kind of talks about what might be called like multiracial whiteness. So that means it becomes inclusive of a lot of Hispanics, particularly as they marry in, or are a huge growing multiracial population. And I think the kind of simplest, I mean, you can come up with all sorts of really exotic plans, but I'd say the simplest thing we could do to get from A to B is to have a sort of expansive vision of what a future American ethnogenesis, for people who are kind of alarmed by a term like white shift. They shouldn't be, but if white just sort of triggers you in a certain
Mm,
way, you could use ethnogenesis, which would be the kind of creation of a new ethnic group, a new kind of American majority group, that would be kind of multiracial in the sense that we think about it, but would kind of all have a cultural referent and even a literal ancestral referent in most
mm,
cases that goes back to the founding fathers or whatever else. So if you incorporate a bunch of multiracial people and Hispanics, or at least a lot of Hispanics, and you close the border and really get control, at least to a large degree, and I think we can have good faith discussions about, I'm pretty much a zero
right,
immigration
right,
guy
right. Yeah.
at this point, but I think you can be higher than a zero immigration person and still be a part of this discussion.
Mm,
um, but if you do those two things and give us some time to have some breathing room to kind of have this ethnogenesis, you're still going to have a multiracial and multi-ethnic society, but you'll have a clear majority.
mm,
And when you have a really clear and substantial majority, I think that can create ethnic peace. And that group can also, because they're not threatened,
mm,
then be very expansive in terms of how it welcomes other groups to participate and play in that story. And I think that that's actually, with all of the difficulties and shortcomings and everything else that you could say in America's racial and other history, but that's a lot of the story. And including, we kind of talked at the top, the entire notion of whiteness, while it's not totally arbitrary, because if you go back to the 1790 Naturalization Act and debate, they're talking about white people and everybody understands what that is.
mm,
So it's not totally arbitrary, but there's certainly, within America's history, you can go back, for especially if you're like me, very familiar with these immigration debates, and the swarthy Jews or the swarthy
right.
Italians or the very questionable Irish or whoever it was, were not maybe kind of fully integrated into that whiteness as a concept in people's minds. But over time, they really became, or the Poles, very much integrated into that majority culture. And it was just a question of being open and everybody kind of aiming for the same thing
Mm.
over the long term.
I mean, this is interestingly, and I'm not kind of inviting you to rant politically because I think we probably both basically want the same outcome in 2024. But like, this is interestingly, I think, why Trump's strongest thing is and always has been immigration is because people sense one way or another, whether or not they would articulate it as you just did so ably, that like really one of the major things, if not the major thing, that we need to sort some of this out is time and breathing room, right? It's to turn the spigot off for
Right.
5 seconds. And as you say,
Right.
it doesn't have to be like your kind of farthest possible position. It could be something a little bit more moderate, but just in general, right? Like we actually are really
Right.
good at revising and kind of like stretching our
Right.
conception of who can be an American and all that stuff. Probably like most people you now talk to come from stock that would have been like racially questionable, even if they are white.
Sure.
And so all of
Right.
that, yeah,
I mean, most of the endorsers of my book
right,
probably.
right, right, right.
Tucker Carlson would have, I think he'd pass the whiteness test for anybody. But I mean, not just the people who are obvious visible minorities who've endorsed the book. But I mean, I think, if I were to kind of go down the line, there it would be a whole list of people who might not have been considered fully in the top tier white category at some point in America's
Oh yeah,
history.
I mean
So
you're
absolutely,
talking
I
to
think
like a Jewish, Polish, Irish mutt, like
right,
so all of those are
right,
like and right. So we're all
yeah,
kind of at this point we're all that, and yet that has kind of been incorporated into the red blooded apple pie eating image of an American, right? Um,
sure,
so there is a question that I have for you about language that you kind of alluded to in your answer, and I wanted to pick up on this, which is previously, in the case of all the other ethnic groups that we've just now touched on, uh, the Irish, the Italians, whatever, even to some extent, I think like people who are ethnically Jewish, the picture of assimilation has been a picture of what Kaufman would call white shift. In other words, we came to think of these races as just like kind of white, right? Um, and that
right,
was in some sense synonymous with their incorporation into, and I would even say that like, you know, the like upwardly mobile black people became sort of white, like in that
sure,
sense. Um, but that language is incendiary. I mean, it's incendiary now in the way that, and it's been made incendiary by exactly the kind of anti-white rhetoric and hatred that you are writing
right,
about in your book. And so we end up with one of these problems that really fascinates me of rhetorical territory. And I'm sure you've got like interesting things to say about this. Is what we're saying that we want more and more people to become white, or are you saying like we want more and more people to
right,
become American? Like, what's the right language now to
right.
talk about this stuff?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, and I think it's interesting because I really kind of focus on this kind of white shift concept because I just like it
Yeah.
intellectually. But yet, I think if I were rewriting that again, I would put. It's not that I don't mention it, but I put more emphasis on this idea of an American ethnogenesis because I just think it's less
Mm.
threatening to people, and nobody's like doing paper bag tests or anything like that to
Yep.
like prove their official racial purity such that they can belong to the white category. But I think the idea is we do want to have a normative American category, and the reality is that that is going to culturally be tied in some very significant ways to whiteness, both in terms of just like genetics, but also just in terms of the cultural history. Um, but I think again, maybe if I, as I talk about this and I begin to do more of these interviews, I'm like, I'm going to emphasize that American element because I think we kind of have a better referent for talking about that, and it doesn't set off some of the tripwires.
Yeah.
Um, even in writing a book about whiteness, that it does. So
Yeah, and you know what? It has the advantage of being true to what we're actually talking
yeah,
about. Like at least to me,
sure,
I want to be an American, damn it, and I want all these other people to be
right,
Americans. And what dismays me is not that like they're different colors than me. It dismays me that they're talking about color so much. And like,
right,
and yes, in order to get past that, we have to talk about the fact that you know a lot of the people that built this country look a certain way, but also
right,
it does seem like our end goal is closer to like Americanness
right.
than to whiteness. um
Well, then let me
yeah.
let me pick back up on Trump because I think you said something that was really interesting, and I'd like to develop it.
Mm,
Which is, I think, a fascinating thing that we're seeing in polling is that Trump, who is the avatar of white supremacy, and I don't mean that, of course, that he's actually an avatar
mm,
of white supremacy. I mean
yeah.
that's what his critics would say. And yet, if you look at the polling right now, no Republican, at least in my knowledge in my lifetime, has had such a tight um, kind of racial gap. In other words,
Yep.
he's doing like the gap between his white support and his Hispanic support, for example, is at a record low. And that's partially because he really turns off managerial class whites of a certain type, but it's also because he's really appealing to a lot of Hispanics and whatnot, who are kind of more working class in their operativeness. And I think a classic way to look at this is this thing he just did in this bodega in New York City, where he went down and he kind of the bodega where this Hispanic guy had been attacked. This was maybe a year ago, and he defended himself and he killed the assailant. And Alvin Bragg, the New York City DA, charged him, and there was a huge firestorm because the guy was clearly just defending himself, and it was dropped. I think Trump has, in an American sense, like, the fact that this guy was, I think, originally from the Dominican Republic and it was Hispanic, he's just like, that guy is an American.
Yeah.
You know, he's working hard. He's at his store. You know, he's doing all the right things that we'd like him to do. Trump has a visceral support for those people, and I mean that in the broadest possible sense, like a kind of regular Americans of all hues. And I think voters just get that instinctually, whereas the Democrats really kind of, maybe they'll take their support, but they don't even really like them at the end of the day.
Yeah.
And so when I kind of talk about that American ethnogenesis, it kind of incorporates like the guy who's at the bodega working hard and you know, kind of doing his thing. And so I think that is, you know, part of a way this plays out.
Absolutely. It reminds me of my favorite thing anybody's ever said about Donald Trump, which is ironic. It's Franny Leibowitz, I think, who said this, that he's a poor person's idea of a rich person. And she was being insufferable and trying to put him down. But I think that's the best thing anybody's ever, this is the best compliment anybody's ever paid him, and true. And speaks also, and similar to what you're talking about. Well, the book is called, it is now called officially Unprotected Class. We're going to drop a link to it in the show notes and all of that so people can find it there. But just to sign off here, tell the folks at home where they can find you and how they can get your book.
Sure. So they can get my book wherever fine books are sold, or maybe even where not so fine books are sold. But certainly the easiest way, and the way that probably helps me as well as getting you a good price, is hop on over to Amazon. And you can get it there. I assume, I don't know when this will drop, but the book will be out on the 23rd of April. So very, very soon. If you order it now, you'll basically get it as soon as you'd get it if you'd pre-ordered quite some time ago. So you can get that there. You can find the rest of my work at places like The American Mind, where Spencer is busy being a very capable editor and occasionally cracking the whip to get folks like me to write hopefully somewhat interesting things, but also The American Greatness, American Conservative, etc. If you follow me on X/Twitter at @RealJeremyCarl, I always have my work there, and I have a new Substack called The Course of Empire, and I would love to have folks sign up for that and check that out as well.
That is a good stack. We'll link to that too in the show notes. I think I'm recommending you on my Substack, but if I'm not, I will start doing that now. Terrific. Thank you, Jeremy. It's been a pleasure as always.
Absolutely, Spencer. Pleasure to talk to you, and pleasure to speak to your very culturally enlightened audience.
You do them too much credit. Don't give them big heads.